The snow fell thick and relentless, coating the isolated village of Grey Hollow in a shroud of white. It was the kind of snowfall that muffled sound, leaving the world eerily silent. To those who lived in the village, winter wasn't just a season, it was a curse. Eliza Walker, the village historian, had spent her entire life documenting Grey Hollow's peculiar traditions. Every winter, the townsfolk would carve intricate symbols into the snow around their homes, forming a protective circle. The symbols, they claimed, kept the frostbound at bay. Eliza, ever the skeptic, dismissed the stories as superstition. But as the first blizzard of the season descended, she couldn't ignore the unease settling over the village. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and not a soul dared to walk the streets after sunset. That night, Eliza sat by her fireplace, poring over old journals. The entries were cryptic, written in a mix of English and a language she couldn't identify. They spoke of a figure that came with the first snow, a being that hunted those who broke the circle. Her eyes lingered on one passage. "It is not the cold that kills, but the thing that wears it." A loud thud jolted her from her reading. It came from the front door. Eliza froze, her heart pounding. No one would be out in this storm. Another thud, louder this time. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace and crept toward the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence. Then came a sound that sent a chill racing down her spine. A long, slow scrape, as if something sharp was being dragged across the wooden door. Eliza's hand shook as she turned the lock and flung the door open. There was nothing but snow, yet her eyes were drawn downward to the deep gouges carved into the wood, claw marks. She slammed the door shut and backed away, her breath coming in quick gasps. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Eliza!" The whisper came from behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her mind raced. The village stories flooded back, tales of how the frostbound couldn't enter homes protected by the circle. She hadn't carved one outside her own house. Panic gripped her as she grabbed her coat and boots. She burst into the snowstorm, the wind clawing at her face. The world was a blur of white, and the cold was so intense it felt alive, wrapping around her like an icy hand. She crouched in the snow, frantically tracing the protective symbols she had seen her neighbors carve. Her fingers were numb, her breath ragged. Behind her, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Eliza!" She dared to glance over her shoulder. A figure stood at the edge of her vision, tall and gaunt, its body wrapped in a cloak of swirling snow. Its face, or lack thereof, was a void, a dark abyss where features should have been. Her hands fumbled, the symbols incomplete. The figure moved closer, its steps silent despite the crunching snow. The air around it seemed to freeze solid, the temperature dropping with each step. "Eliza!" The voice was inside her head now, a deafening chorus of whispers. She screamed, finishing the last symbol just as the figure reached the edge of the circle. It stopped, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying her. For a long moment they stared at one another, her breath clouding the air between them. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the storm. Eliza collapsed into the snow, her body shaking with sobs. When she finally crawled back into her house, she bolted the door and sat by the fire until dawn. The next morning, the storm had passed. The village was quiet, the protective circles intact, but Eliza knew what she had seen. For the rest of the winter, she carved the symbols religiously, each line and curve etched with trembling precision. She became a believer, her skepticism buried under the weight of what she'd survived. And every time the snow began to fall, she would hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling her name from the edge of the circle. The snowstorm began with an ominous silence. No wind, no warning, just a stillness that settled over the mountainous woods like a predator lying in wait. Maya Daniels, a wildlife photographer, had come to Glacier Reach to capture the rare Arctic foxes rumored to roam the area. She'd spent days trekking through the wilderness, her camera capturing glimpses of frozen streams and towering pines, but the elusive foxes had yet to appear. She had been about to turn back when the storm descended. It started as a soft fluttering of snow, delicate and harmless. But within an hour, the wind began to howl and the snowfall thickened into an impenetrable wall of white. Maya tried to find her way back to her campsite, but the landmarks she had memorized, twisted trees, a jagged boulder, were gone, swallowed by the blizzard. Panic began to set in as the temperature dropped. Her fingers felt like ice despite her gloves, and each breath burned her throat. She tightened her scarf around her face, squinting through the storm when she saw it, a dark silhouette against the white. At first she thought it was a cabin, a simple shelter built by a hunter or ranger. But as she drew closer, its size became apparent. The building was massive, with steep gables and frost-covered windows. Icicles hung like jagged teeth from the roof, and the wooden exterior was aged, almost blackened, as if scorched by time. She hesitated. Something about the lodge felt wrong. It stood alone in the wilderness, untouched by the storm as though it had been waiting for her. But the wind was relentless and her body ached from the cold. Survival overrode her instincts. She trudged to the heavy wooden door and knocked, her gloved fist making a dull, hollow sound. No answer came. With shaking hands, she pushed it open. The interior was colder than she expected, the air biting and stale. Her boots echoed against the floor as she stepped inside, closing the door against the storm. The lodge was vast, with a high ceiling supported by dark beams. A massive stone fireplace sat at the far end of the room, its hearth empty and cold. Dust covered the furniture, and sheets draped over some of the larger pieces gave the space the eerie look of a forgotten mausoleum. Maya set her pack down and lit the lantern she carried, its warm glow casting flickering shadows across the room. As she explored, she noticed strange details. The floorboards beneath her boots were icy to the touch, as though the cold seeped up from beneath the earth. The windows, though frosted over, seemed to distort the storm outside, making it appear darker, heavier. Her exploration led her to a dining room. A long table stretched nearly the length of the room, its surface covered in a fine layer of frost. Plates, goblets, and cutlery were arranged as if for a grand feast, but no food was present, just frost and a faint smell of something metallic. A chill ran down her spine and she turned back toward the main room. She decided to light a fire and wait out the storm. As she piled wood into the fireplace, she noticed strange carvings etched into the stone. The symbols were intricate, curling into shapes that hurt her eyes if she stared too long. She shook her head, dismissing the unease gnawing at her, and struck a match. The fire roared to life, and for a moment she felt a semblance of safety. She wrapped herself in her blanket, her camera by her side, and let the warmth lull her into a light sleep. She awoke with a start. The fire had burned low, casting the room in dim, flickering light. Something had woken her, a sound faint but distinct. It was a shuffle like fabric dragging across the floor. Maya sat up, gripping her lantern. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The lodge was silent, but the unease remained. She glanced toward the door, half expecting to see it wide open, but it was shut tight. And then she saw them, footprints in the frost, leading from the dining room toward the fireplace where she sat. Her breath caught. The prints weren't hers, they were too large, the stride too long. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. Who's there? A creak answered her, coming from above. She tilted the lantern toward the staircase leading to the second floor. The shadows there seemed darker, heavier, as though they were watching her. Against every instinct, she climbed the stairs. Each step groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with every step. The hallway at the top was narrow, lined with doors. She opened the first one and found a bedroom, its bed neatly made but coated in frost. The next room was a study, filled with books that crumbled to dust at her touch. The last door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. As she approached, a faint whisper reached her ears, barely audible over the pounding of her heart.
Maya.
She froze. The whisper came again, softer, closer.
Maya.
She shoved the door open. The room was empty except for a cracked mirror leaning against the far wall. The surface of the glass was warped, its reflection hazy and distorted. As she stepped closer, her lantern flickered, casting her reflection in and out of view. But when the flame steadied, her reflection did not. The figure in the mirror wasn't her. It was taller, gaunt, its face pale and hollow, with empty sockets where eyes should have been. It tilted its head, mimicking her movements, and then its lips moved. "Leave," it whispered. Maya stumbled back, dropping the lantern. The glass shattered, plunging the room into darkness. She ran, her boots slipping on the icy floor as the whispers grew louder, echoing from every direction. She reached the main hall, the fire now completely out. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling like a living thing. She grabbed her pack and flung the door open, running into the blizzard without looking back. Maya didn't stop running until she collapsed in the snow, her body trembling with exhaustion. The storm was relentless, the cold seeping into her bones. Just as she thought she wouldn't make it, she saw lights piercing through the snow. A search team found her the next morning, half frozen and rambling about the lodge. They dismissed her story, insisting there was no lodge in that part of the woods, just an endless stretch of untouched wilderness. But Maya knew what she had seen. She reviewed her photographs weeks later, hoping to find some proof. Most were blurred, ruined by the storm. Except for one. It was a picture of the lodge, its windows glowing faintly as if lit from within. And in the foreground stood a figure, tall and pale, watching her through the snow.